There is a word in the Vale language. It does not translate well. Most translators just skip it, put a dash where it should be, move on. But I want you to understand this word before I tell you anything else, because everything that happened on Cathara Station in the Outer Meridian on the day the humans arrived, it all comes back to this one word. The word is Vethral. It means roughly something like the fear you feel when a story you were told as a child turns out to be true, not the fear of the thing itself. The fear of realizing the story was real all along. That someone somewhere a very long time ago saw something and tried to warn you, and no one listened. That is Vethral. I felt it once in my life, just once. And I felt it the moment the docking bay doors opened on Cathara Station, and the humans walked through. But I am getting ahead of myself. My name is Suvrak. I'm an elder of the Vale Collective 3rd Meridian Branch. I am 412 years old, which for my species is not particularly old, middle-aged, really, perhaps a little past it. I have seen 3 interstellar wars, 2 species extinctions by natural causes, 1 by unfortunate galactic misunderstanding, and more diplomatic failures than I can count on all 6 of my hands. I tell you this not to establish credentials, though the Archive Commission seems very concerned with credentials. I tell you this because I want you to understand that when I say I had never seen anything like what I saw that day on Cathara Station, I mean it in a way that should mean something. I am not a young person prone to dramatic statements. I am a tired, oldish bureaucrat who has spent his life watching things happen from behind glass panels and report terminals. And even I felt Vethral. So let me go back. Let me go back to the beginning, not just of the events on the station, the real beginning. The legends of the Ur-Cathari are very old. The Ur-Cathari were a nomadic species, bipedal, carbon-based, extinct now for approximately 6,000 galactic cycles. We do not know a great deal about them. What we know from fragments, cave markings on Discivox Prime, stone tablets recovered from the Keth asteroid belt, a few intact data crystals found in a wrecked vessel drifting near the outer Meridian border. They were not particularly advanced, technologically. They had achieved basic space travel, rudimentary communication arrays, nothing remarkable. But they were storytellers, remarkable storytellers. The kind of species that, when they encountered something they could not explain, did not just file a report or build a monument. They sat around fires, or whatever equivalent they had, and they told each other the story over and over until it became part of their species' memory. One of those stories was about humanity. They did not call humans humans, of course. They had a name for them. It was a word that the translation algorithms have never been able to render perfectly, but the closest approximation, the one the Archive Commission settled on, is simply the Broken Ones. The Ur-Cathari story of the Broken Ones appears in at least 4 separate cave marking sites across 2 different star systems, which tells you something. That level of geographic spread suggests a narrative that was already ancient by the time those marks were made. Something passed down through so many generations it had baked itself into the culture, like a warning that every child was told before they were told anything else. I read those stories when I was young. Most Vale scholars do. They are considered foundational texts, the kind of historical artifact you study to understand early galactic civilization. And what I remember from reading them, the feeling I had was mostly pity for the Ur-Cathari, because their story of the Broken Ones was clearly born from fear, and the fear was clearly born from not understanding, from encountering something they lacked the framework to interpret. Here is what the Ur-Cathari said about the Broken Ones. They said these creatures are wrong. Not dangerous, not evil, wrong, like a mathematical equation that should not balance but does, like a moon orbiting backwards. They described creatures that were, and I am giving you the scholarly translation now, the careful, considered one structurally misaligned with the universe's intent. A species that should have died by every measure in its infancy. A species without shells, without venom, without speed, without strength enough to matter. A prey animal, essentially, by the biological metrics that most of the galaxy uses to classify things. Fragile bone structure, single-layer skin. Internally placed organs with minimal skeletal protection. No natural weapons beyond flat, blunt teeth and fingernails that would barely scratch stone. And yet, they were here. The Ur-Cathari did not understand this. It troubled them deeply. They had a framework for the galaxy most young species do, a kind of reassuring logic that says, the strong survive, the weak do not, this is how things work. And then they encountered the broken ones and the framework broke, because the broken ones were by every measure weak. And they had not only survived, they had proliferated. They had covered their home world. They had reached into space. They had begun building things. The Ur-Cathari word for what the broken ones had done, the way they described their survival, it also does not translate well. The closest I can get is winning by refusing to lose, or perhaps surviving through sheer wrongness. And they warned, very clearly the stories warned. They said, do not mistake the softness of these creatures for gentleness. Do not mistake their fragility for weakness. There is something inside them, something in the architecture of what they are, that does not understand limits. That does not understand the concept of too much. They described watching humans in a conflict and being struck not by the violence itself, which the Ur-Cathari had seen plenty of in their travels, but by the quality of the violence, the personal quality of it. The way a human in crisis seemed to compress, to become smaller in some ways and larger in others simultaneously, and then to act. They do not calculate, one Ur-Cathari text said. They do not assess, they simply respond. As though the situation speaks directly to something in their center, and that thing answers before the mind has time to consider the consequences. The scholars laughed at this. Not all of them, not openly, but there was a certain condescension that I remember from my early academic years when the Ur-Cathari texts came up in seminar discussions. A gentle, scholarly amusement at the naive terror of an unsophisticated species. Because by the time I was a young Vale scholar reading those fragments, humanity had been part of the galactic community for about 200 cycles, and they did not seem particularly terrifying. They were loud. They were enthusiastic. They had very strange eating habits and an obsession with a beverage called coffee that none of the other species had been able to explain. They were decent diplomats, not the best, but decent. They got emotional in negotiations sometimes, which was considered a liability. They were slightly shorter on average than most of the sapient species they interacted with. They smiled too much, which several species found deeply unsettling for reasons they struggled to articulate. They were, in the galactic community's collective assessment, fine. A young species, still growing into themselves, perhaps a little raw around the edges. The Ur-Cathari texts were treated as what archaeologists call fear projection narratives. Stories a primitive species creates to explain something that frightened them, something they didn't understand, and in not understanding it made it monstrous. Happens all the time. It was considered, frankly, one of the more charming things about the Ur-Cathari corpus, the monsters in the margins of a young species mythology. I was among those who thought this. For most of my life I thought this. I was wrong. Let me tell you about Cathara Station. You may know it by its earlier name, Outpost 17, which was what it was called when the Vale Collective first built it, about 60 cycles ago. But by the time of the events I am describing, it had grown considerably. Cathara Station sat at the junction of 3 significant trade routes in the outer meridian: the Vale Collective's primary deep space resupply chain, the Hekari Syndicate's eastern shipping corridor, and a small but commercially important route that the humans had established to their colony worlds on the fringe of the meridian. It was not a glamorous place. It was busy, loud. It smelled permanently of engine fuel, and something the Hekari exported in large quantities that I could never quite identify and preferred not to. Approximately 4,000 beings of various species lived and worked on the station at any given time. It was the kind of place where everyone was either going somewhere or coming back from somewhere, and nobody stayed longer than they had to. I was there because I was there, a bureaucrat's answer. I was overseeing a routine trade arbitration involving the Vale Collective, the Hekari Syndicate, and a small consortium of independent traders. Nothing dramatic. The kind of slow, grinding administrative work that keeps civilizations running and that no one ever writes stories about. I had been on the station for 11 days. I expected to be there another 9. The Galactic Defense Patrol vessel, the GDP Ardent, docked on the 4th day after my arrival. Standard procedure. The GDP maintained a rotating garrison presence on Cathara Station. Nothing unusual. The garrison consisted of 3 units, 1 Hekari heavy infantry squad, 1 Dravar scout contingent, and 1 unit of human soldiers. Now GDP units were mixed species by charter. This was intentional, a deliberate policy decision made about 40 cycles prior, after several ugly incidents where single-species garrison forces had developed the kind of species loyalty problems that lead to bad outcomes in volatile environments. Mixed units had better conflict resolution records, better de-escalation outcomes, lower overall incident rates. The data was clear. It worked. The human soldiers were GDP Unit 14, 7th Human Division. I know this because I have read the incident report many times since, in preparing this testimony. At the time, I barely noticed their arrival. I saw them move through the docking bay during my second morning on the station, 8 of them in the dark gray and blue armor of the GDP ground forces, helmet visors up, carrying their equipment cases with the slightly too deliberate efficiency of soldiers trying to look casual. Their commanding officer was a woman named Vasquez. I know her name now. At the time, she was just one more uniform in a busy docking bay. They took up garrison positions. They did their job. Patrols, checkpoint monitoring, the usual. For 3 days, they were background noise. Then the Koth arrived. I need to explain something about the Koth, because if you do not understand the Koth, you will not understand what happened next. The Koth are a military civilization. This is not an insult, it is a descriptor. They have structured their entire society, their economics, their politics, their culture, their art, their philosophy, around the concept of martial hierarchy. Their species produces soldiers the way some species produce scholars or merchants. It is simply what they do and what they value and who they are. Their warriors are among the most decorated in the known galaxy. In 3 of the 5 interstellar conflicts I mentioned earlier in my testimony, Koth ground forces were decisive factors in the outcome. They are not to be taken lightly. They are also, it must be said, deeply conscious of status, of hierarchy, of the visual and behavioral markers that indicate rank, power, dominance. In Koth culture, a being who does not display appropriate deference to a superior force, or who fails to register fear in the presence of something more powerful, is considered either stupid or disrespectful, and the Koth find both unforgivable. The Koth delegation that arrived at Cathara Station on that 6th day was not officially a hostile force. They were there for a resource negotiation, mining rights in a disputed corridor of the outer meridian, which the Koth had recently decided they wanted. The negotiation was being handled through the station's administrative council, which I was not part of, though as a senior Vale official I was kept informed. What I was not told, what none of us were told, was that the lead negotiator, a Koth commander named Veldrot, had come with a different primary objective. He was not there to negotiate. He was there to assess. He was there to make a point. The Koth had been expanding their sphere of influence in the outer meridian for about 20 cycles, quietly, incrementally, in the way that aggressive civilizations sometimes do when they want to move a border without anyone calling it what it is. Cathara Station sat at a junction they wanted, and Veldrot had been sent to determine how much resistance they would face if they simply took it. The assessment would not be conducted openly, of course. It would be conducted the way Koth assessments are always conducted, by creating pressure and observing how things respond to it. They arrived on a heavy cruiser, not a warship technically, but the line between a Koth, heavy transport, and a warship is a line that exists primarily in Koth diplomatic correspondence and nowhere else in the physical universe. 200 Koth soldiers disembarked, 200 for a station with a garrison of approximately 60 mixed species GDP troops. This was not coincidence. This was calibration. They came in their full ceremonial armor, the heavy black and copper of the Koth warrior caste, the kind of armor that is designed not just for protection but for impression. Koth ceremonial armor has acoustic baffles built into it, which cause the wearer's footsteps to produce a low, resonant concussion with every step. You do not just see a Koth warrior approach. You feel it in your chest. I have met Dravar diplomats who had to sit down after their first encounter with a Koth ceremonial unit in full regalia. The effect is fully intentional. They took up positions throughout the station. Not aggressive positions, technically. They did not point weapons at anyone. They did not issue demands. They simply occupied space. They stood in the corridors and the docking bays and the central commerce ring, 200 warriors in full ceremonial armor, and they made the station feel smaller, tighter, like the walls had moved. I watched this happen from the observation level above the main commerce ring. I watched various species on the station register the Koth presence and adjust accordingly. Hikari traders quietly relocated their stalls toward the back walls. Dravar station workers found reasons to be in other sections. A contingent of veiled diplomatic staffers that had been taking their meal break in the commerce ring suddenly remembered appointments elsewhere. It was not panic. It was the intelligent, species survival instinct to move away from the thing that could hurt you. The galaxy runs on this instinct. It is not cowardice, it is sense. And then the 8 human soldiers of GDP Unit 14 came through the commerce ring on their routine patrol. And they did not stop. I want to be very precise about what I saw, because I have replayed it in my memory many times, and I want to make sure the testimony is accurate. The 8 humans, led by Vasquez, with the others spread out behind her in the slightly loose formation that GDP mixed patrols used, came through the east entrance of the commerce ring at their normal patrol pace. Not hurrying, not slow. The pace of people doing a job they have done many times before. They entered the ring and the Koth were there. 200 of them. In the middle of the ring, around the edges, in the corridors. The acoustic concussion of 200 pairs of armored feet shifting to track the new arrivals moved through the floor like something alive. I watched Vasquez. She registered the Koth, of course she did. Her head moved, a quick scan, the efficient visual assessment of someone who has been trained to enter a room and immediately understand what is in it. She took in the numbers, the positioning, the armor, the weapons at rest but present. And then she kept walking. The same pace, the same direction, toward the center of the ring where the main patrol route ran. I heard from my position above one of the other human soldiers, a young man, the one their records list as Corporal Henriksen, though I didn't know his name then, say something quietly. The translation unit in my earpiece rendered it approximately as, "There's about 200 of them, Sergeant." Vasquez said something back. The translation unit gave me, "Yeah, I can count." And she kept walking. The Koth noticed. Of course they noticed. The whole point of 200 warriors in ceremonial armor was to be noticed, and the whole point of being noticed was to produce a response. They had produced responses from every other being in that commerce ring. They had produced responses from GDP garrison troops before, not always panic, but always some form of accommodation. A route change, a pace increase, a visible desire to be somewhere else. These were the expected responses. These were the responses that told the Koth what they needed to know. The humans gave them none of these responses. Vasquez walked the patrol route through the middle of the commerce ring as though 200 Koth warriors were slightly inconvenient furniture. Her soldiers followed in formation. When a pair of Koth stationed at the center of the route did not move, Vasquez stopped, stood for a moment, and then said, and the translation unit was clearly having some difficulty with the precise phrasing, but it rendered this as, "You're in my patrol route. Can you move or do I need to go around you?" Not a threat, not aggression. The tone was the same tone you use to ask someone if the seat next to them is taken. The Koth did not move immediately. This was itself a signal. In Koth interaction protocols, not moving is a statement. It says, "I have assessed you and found you insufficient to warrant my effort." Vasquez waited approximately 3 seconds. Then she stepped around them, rejoined her patrol route, and continued. "I am old, as I said, 412. I have seen a great many things, but I had never, before that moment, seen anything look quite so completely unbothered in the presence of something designed to bother them. The situation deteriorated over the following hour. Not through violence, not yet, through escalation. Through the Koth doing what the Koth do when their initial display produces insufficient effect, they increased the display. More armor was brought from the ship. Acoustic units were deployed, devices that amplified the concussive effect of the Koth warriors' footsteps across the entire station. The lighting in the commerce ring shifted as the Koth stationed people near the environmental control panels and made certain adjustments. Koth psychology holds that controlling the light in a space is a fundamental marker of dominance. The being who controls the light controls the environment. It is, admittedly, effective. There is something very old in most sapient species that responds badly to shifts in lighting. Something pre-civilizational. Something that lives in the part of the brain where the concept of predator was first developed. The Hekari traders who had retreated to the back walls retreated further. Several of the station's civilian staff were now openly distressed. The Koth were watching all of this, cataloging it. The assessment was proceeding as planned, producing the expected data. And then Commander Veldrot himself came through the north entrance. I had not seen him before. I had seen his files, which described him as a decorated commander and experienced negotiator, which in Koth terms is not two separate things. He was large, Koth commanders are, on average, physically impressive, and Veldrot was on the impressive end of impressive. He wore the black and deep copper armor of a senior commander, the plates layered with the insignia of military rank that the Koth consider the most important biographical information a being can carry on their person. He walked with the particular economy of movement of someone who has never in his life had to convince anyone of his authority before he opened his mouth. He came to the center of the commerce ring. He stood, and he looked at the humans. I think he had expected by this point that the GDP garrison would have established some kind of formal position, retreated to a defensible cluster, signaled for reinforcement, something. The acoustic units were generating a subsonic pulse that I could feel in my molars, and I was on the observation level. At commerce ring level, where the humans stood, it must have been considerably worse. Vasquez was standing near the central water circulation structure, a decorative feature of the ring, a tall column of moving liquid that was about the only aesthetically pleasant thing about Cathara Station. She had her hands loose at her sides. She was watching Veldrot approach. He stopped about 4 meters from her. This is important. 4 meters is a Koth negotiating distance. It means I am engaging with you, but I have not decided yet whether you are worth engaging with. He spoke to her in Koth. The station's public translation system rendered it approximately as, "This station will be operating under Koth security protocols effective immediately. Your garrison unit is to stand down and confine itself to the docking bay of your vessel pending further instructions." There was silence in the commerce ring. I mean actual, complete silence. The kind that happens when every being in a room is holding their breath at the same time. Vasquez looked at Veldrot for a long moment. I could not see her face clearly from where I stood, but I could see her posture. She was still. Not the stillness of fear, I have seen that, and it is a different thing. It was the stillness of someone thinking, carefully, in the space of a second or two, running through something. Then she said, "With respect, Commander, I don't recognize Koth authority on a GDP-administered station, so that's not going to happen." Just that, clean and quiet, that's not going to happen. Veldrot was silent for a moment. I learned later from accounts of others who were closer, who could read his facial expressions, which I could not from the observation level, that this was the moment his assessment shifted. Not to alarm. The Koth do not alarm easily, but to something like recalibration. He had encountered something he had not fully accounted for in his models. He said, "You are 8. I have 200. Vasquez said, "I know." He said, "You understand what I am telling you?" She said, "Yeah, I understand. We're still not moving." And then there was a longer silence. And I felt it for the first time in my 400 years. Vethrul, the ancient word, the fear of the story coming true. Because I remembered the Ur-Cathari texts. I had read them as a young scholar. I had thought them charming and naive and mildly condescending toward. And standing on the observation level above a commerce ring on Cathara Station, watching 8 humans and 200 Koth soldiers, and whatever was about to happen, I remembered a sentence from one of those texts. One of the cave markings, translated from the Ur-Cathari original. It went, "They do not calculate the odds. The odds do not appear to reach them." I had thought that was poetry, metaphor, a primitive people reaching for a way to describe something alien to them. I did not think that anymore. What happened next moved very quickly, and my account of it should be understood as the account of someone watching from above, not someone who was present at eye level. Others who were closer have given more detailed testimony. Mine is the account of someone who saw the shape of the thing. Veldrot signaled. It was subtle, a movement of 2 fingers on his left gauntlet, the kind of small command gesture that Koth commanders use when they want action without announcing it. 3 of his warriors, the ones stationed nearest to the human patrol, moved to flanking positions. Not an attack, not yet. A pressure movement, the beginning of an enclosure. The response from the human soldiers happened so fast that I almost missed it. The 8 of them, who had been in a loose patrol formation, shifted simultaneously. No command that I could hear, no visible signal. They were simply, suddenly, in a different configuration. A compact semicircle, facing outward, backs to the water column. The kind of movement that you perform so many times in training that it stops being a decision and becomes a reflex. And Vasquez did not move into the semicircle. Vasquez moved toward Veldrot. I need to dwell on this for a moment, because I have thought about it many times since, and I still find it difficult to articulate exactly what I felt watching it. She moved toward him, alone. Away from her soldiers, toward the commander of 200, across the 4 meters of space between them. Her hands were not raised. She was not running. She walked with that same deliberate quality I had noticed in the docking bay when they arrived, the slightly too deliberate efficiency, except now I understood that it was not a performance of casualness. It was something else. It was the particular controlled pace of someone who is afraid and is not letting the fear run the legs. That distinction matters. I want you to understand that distinction. She was not unafraid. I do not believe, knowing what I know now about human physiology, that she was unafraid. The subsonic pulse from the Koth acoustic units would have been doing things to her nervous system that are measurable and documented. She was a human in a confined space with 200 hostile warriors, and she was alone, and she was walking toward the largest one. She was doing it anyway. She stopped an arm's length from Veldrot. She had to look up slightly. He had the significant height advantage that Koth commanders typically have. She said something to him, quietly, that the room's translation system did not fully capture. The account from a Hikari trader who was standing closer gives a rough version of it, and the Archive Commission included it in the incident report. She said, approximately, "I'm going to tell you something, Commander, and I want you to hear it properly. We are not leaving this station. We are not retreating to our ship. We are going to stay right here and do the job we were sent to do. And if you want to make something of that, then I guess we find out what happens next. But I want you to know, and I want you to know that I mean this, that my people do not leave. We do not. It is not a thing we are able to do. So whatever you are calculating right now, whatever you are assessing, factor that in." Veldrot looked at her. There is a term in Koth military culture for what happens when a warrior assesses something and arrives at an unexpected answer. The word means, roughly, recalibration, the pause before a new strategy, the gap between certainty and uncertainty. I am told, by those who know Koth body language better than I do, that Veldrot stood in that gap for longer than anyone had ever seen him stand there. And then he said, "You are one soldier." And Vasquez said, "Yeah, but there's 8 of us, and there'll be more after." I have to tell you about Henriksen, because while Vasquez was having this exchange with Veldrot, something was happening on the other side of the commerce ring that I almost missed, and that in some ways is the more important story. There was a civilian on the station, a Dravar child, a young one, perhaps 6 or 7 cycles old, who had wandered from his family's quarters in the residential section and found himself in the commerce ring at exactly the wrong time. Children do this. It does not matter what species, children wander. His name was Ivet, and he was standing near one of the commerce ring's support columns, very small and very still, with the particular stillness of a young creature that knows something is wrong but cannot identify the exit. One of the Koth warriors, moving to adjust a flanking position as Veldrot gave his signal, came close to Ivet, very close, close enough that the acoustic concussion of the warrior's steps would have been painful to a small Dravar at that range. And the warrior, not deliberately, I believe, but not entirely accidentally either, moved in a way that put himself between the child and the rest of the room. A wall of black and copper armor. A being whose shoulder was at approximately the height of the child's head. Ivet made a sound, a small one, the kind of sound that is too frightened to be a cry. Henriksen heard it. He was at the far end of the semicircle, on the edge, and he heard that small sound in the middle of everything else that was happening. The acoustic pulse, the movement, the exchange between Vasquez and Veldrot, and he turned. He saw the child, and he moved. Not fast, not with aggression. He walked the same controlled pace as Vasquez across the commerce ring, in front of 3 Koth warriors who tracked him and did not move to stop him because they were not sure yet what he was doing, and in the uncertainty they defaulted to stillness. He walked to where the child stood. He crouched down, and he was in full GDP armor, which is not easy to crouch in, so that he was at the child's eye level. And he said something to the child in Dravar, which is a language I would not expect a human GDP corporal to speak. But Henriksen apparently did, because Ivet's small, frightened stillness broke, and the child made a different sound, a less frightened one. Henriksen held out a hand. The Dravar child took it, and Henriksen still crouched, while Vasquez was telling Veldrat that her people do not leave, turned so that his back was between the Koth warrior and the child, and he stayed there. Just stayed there. A human soldier in armor, crouched on the floor of a commerce ring in the middle of a standoff with 200 Koth warriors, with a small Dravar child holding his hand. I am 412 years old. I have been in diplomatic service for over 300 of those years. I have read the Ur-Cathari texts about the broken ones, and I have watched scholars laugh at those texts, and I was among those who laughed, if quietly, if inwardly. I did not laugh again after that moment, because the Ur-Cathari were not wrong. They were not being primitive, and they were not projecting, and they were not misunderstanding what they had seen. They had seen what I was seeing in some version on some world 6,000 cycles ago. And they had tried to tell everyone who came after them. They had carved it into stone and pressed it into data crystals and woven it into stories that their children told their children's children. And what they had seen, what they were trying to say, was not that humans were monsters. I understand that now. The word monster implies something monstrous, something outside the category of understandable, something cruel for cruelty's sake. That is not what the Ur-Cathari were describing. What they were describing was this: a species that does not understand the word enough. Most species have a threshold, a point at which the calculation becomes clear, the cost is too high, the odds are too long, the outcome is too uncertain, and they stop, they retreat, they accommodate. Not out of weakness, out of sense. Out of a deep biological agreement with the principle that survival means knowing when to yield. Humans do not have this threshold, or they have it, and it does not engage when you expect it to. They reach the point where the calculation should turn them back, and something in them, something that is not quite logic and not quite instinct, but something between them, says not yet. And they keep going. This is what the Ur-Cathari called winning, by refusing to lose. This is what I watched in the Cathara Station commerce ring, on the day that 200 Koth warriors and 8 human soldiers looked at each other, and something shifted in the room. The standoff lasted another 40 minutes. I will not describe every moment of it, partly because the full account exists in the incident report, and partly because it is difficult to describe 40 minutes of 200 large armored beings staring at 8 smaller, less armored beings, and the 8 smaller beings simply not being moved by this. The prose would become repetitive. The reality was not repetitive. It was layered and tense, and there were several moments that could have tipped into something catastrophic. But the shape of it is what I am trying to convey. The shape of it was the Koth doing everything they knew how to do, and the humans being, in the Ur-Cathari phrase, structurally misaligned with the universe's intent, by which the Ur-Cathari meant something like, you cannot pressure something that does not recognize pressure as a reason to move. Vasquez sent a communication to Station Command during the standoff. I know what it said because I was in contact with Station Command at the time. She requested backup, not because she was retreating or surrendering, but because she identified correctly that the situation would benefit from reinforcement and that she could request reinforcement without leaving. Both things simultaneously. Stay and ask for help. It is such a simple thing. It is also not a thing that I have seen most beings manage in a crisis, where the fear response tends to collapse complex thinking into binary choices. The additional GDP garrison forces, the Hekari heavy infantry and the Dravar scouts, deployed to the commerce ring within 20 minutes of her request. This changed the calculus for the Koth, if not because of numbers, then because of commitment. The station's administration also formally contacted the Koth delegation's diplomatic channel, and made very clear that the presence of 200 warriors in the commercial district without prior authorization was a violation of the station's operational charter. These things mattered. I do not want to suggest that the humans resolved the situation purely through stubbornness and sheer wrongness, because that would be unfair to the structural factors and the institutional responses that also contributed. The situation was resolved because multiple things happened simultaneously and correctly. But the 40 minutes between Vasquez's refusal to retreat and the arrival of backup, those 40 minutes were resolved by 8 human soldiers, and the way they were resolved was not by fighting or threatening or matching the Koth display with a display of their own. It was by being, very simply, people who had decided where they were standing, and had no apparent interest in revising that decision based on any information the Koth could provide. Veldrot withdrew at the end of those 40 minutes. He did not leave the station. The negotiations continued, eventually producing a result that was considerably less favorable for the Koth than what Veldrot had arrived expecting to achieve. He left the commerce ring with his 200 warriors and returned to the area designated for the Koth delegation. Before he went, he said one more thing to Vasquez. The translation is disputed. The station system and the accounts of 3 separate witnesses all render it slightly differently. But the version that appears most consistently, and that I believe to be the most accurate, is, "What are you?" Not threatening, not rhetorical. The genuine question of someone who has encountered something that does not fit the categories. Vasquez said, and on this all accounts agree, "We're the garrison." And Veldrot looked at her for a moment, and then he walked away. That night I accessed the archive terminal in my quarters on Cathara Station, and I pulled up the Ur-Cathari texts. Not for academic purposes this time, not from a comfortable scholarly distance. I read them differently. I read them as a witness. One passage in particular I read several times. It is from the oldest of the surviving texts, the markings on Discivox Prime, which predate the other sources by at least 1,000 cycles, and which the Archive Commission has always treated as the foundational document. The relevant section in the Commission's translation. The broken ones are not what they appear to be. When you look at them, you see the soft ones, the fragile ones, the ones that should not have lived. But there is something inside them that has no name in our language, something that makes them stand when everything says to fall. We watched one of them face something much greater than itself, and we thought, it will stop. Now it will stop, and it did not stop. And we thought now, and it did not stop, and we thought there must be a point, and we realized watching that perhaps there is not a point. That perhaps this is simply what they are. That the universe built them wrong, or they built themselves wrong, or they found a way to be wrong that the universe accepts. We do not have a word for it. We are afraid of it, but we do not think it is evil. We think it is simply different. We think it is the most different thing we have ever encountered. We warn you, do not assume because they are soft that they are harmless. Do not assume because they smile that they are gentle. There is something in them that does not end. I sat with that for a long time. Then I started writing this testimony. The formal incident report on the Cathara Station standoff is 47 pages long and discusses force projection dynamics, interspecies conflict protocols, and the GDP's response timeline in considerable detail. I have read it. It is accurate as far as it goes. But it does not capture the thing I am trying to describe. The thing that I am not sure I have captured either, though I have tried. The Ur-Cathari tried to capture it 6,000 cycles ago. They failed, or we failed them. Either they could not find the words, or we refused to hear the ones they used. For 6,000 years, their warning sat in stone and crystal, labeled as fear projection narrative, and assigned to the charming primitives section of the Galactic Historical Archive, while humans bought coffee and attended diplomatic functions and made friends and occasionally cried in negotiations. And none of us understood. I understand now. The Ur-Cathari were not warning us about monsters. They were not warning us about violence or expansion or the particular dangers of a young species with weapons and ambition. Those are things the galaxy knows how to manage. They were warning us about something more specific, something harder to document and categorize and file. They were warning us about what it looks like when a species reaches the end of its calculations and simply continues. Not because of ideology, not because of programming, not because of faith, though they have that too. Because it is, apparently, what they do. I am Suvrak of the Veil Collective. I have been in diplomatic service for 300 years. I have read a great many things and believed, until recently, that I had a fairly comprehensive model of what the galaxy contains and how it behaves. The humans have not destroyed my model. They have not overturned it. They have simply added something to it that was missing. The item they have added is this. There are things in this universe that do not stop. The Ur-Cathari tried to tell us. They were right. We should have listened. We are listening now.